In 1916, a series of cataclysmic events overtook this pastoral landscape. These are the now quiet fields of the Somme in northern France, and around here was fought what was probably the bloodiest campaign in British military history. The Battle of the Somme began in the sweltering heat of July 1916 and ended 4.5 months later, bogged down in a sea of mud. When war was declared on August the 4th, 1914, the Minister for War, Lord Kitchener, asked every man to do his duty. In response, more than 1 million men volunteered. The Battle of the Somme would be unique in the way it brought the nation's youth together. The country was caught up in a wave of patriotic fervour. Everyone wanted to be part of the war that would be all over by Christmas. In the first 3 months of the war, some 52,000 northern miners joined up. This despite the fact that the industry was a reserved occupation, exempting them from military service. They were tough young men, the backbone of the British labouring class, used to hardship and ready for anything. Men from all walks of life joined up, and for many reasons, some for patriotism, others for the grand adventure. But for a great many, it was simply to escape poverty and the drab routine of working-class life. Together, they formed the nucleus of Kitchener's new volunteer army. For many young men, the exotic lure of France was too tempting to resist. In the public imagination, it was seen as a country where the wine flowed freely and where the chance of a romantic encounter was a real possibility. A sense of common identity marked Kitchener's army, much of the recruitment relying heavily on bonds of friendship and locality. They became known as the Pals battalions. The men recruited into the Tyneside Irish and Tyneside Scottish were typical of the mood which swept the country. The Tyneside Scottish had appealed for anyone with a claim to Scottish ancestry to come and join their ranks. They were granted the right to wear Glengarry bonnets and to maintain a pipe band. Their motto, harder than hammers. The enthusiastic volunteers who made up the Pals battalions were soon incorporated into the existing old county regiments. There was a chronic lack of equipment and ammunition for the new recruits, and only a handful of retired officers and men to train them, much of their knowledge and methods out of date. Regular and territorial units had suffered heavy casualties in the first few months of the war, and the men of the new army were now needed urgently for duty at the front.
The men presented an inspiring spectacle as they swung down the roads, all in the best of physical condition, marching with a fine spring. We had a ripping crossing. We came on 3 boats. We had a great send-off and a great reception. Cheerio, I'm coming back all right. Anyway, I have that feeling.
The frontline trenches now ran from the North Sea to the Swiss border. In an attempt to break through, the Allies planned a joint offensive on the Somme for the summer of 1916. But in February, near the city of Verdun, the Germans attacked in great strength. This meant the Somme would now be a mainly British attack, with the town of Bapaume as their main objective.
As far as the French were concerned, political and military, it's going to be the first time when the British play a proper, fair share of the burden of fighting on the Western Front. And that could only be where, geographically, where it would be most useful to the French, immediately adjacent to them, a circumstance which would be much more under the control of the French than if an assault, a major offensive, were to have been launched in Flanders. And the fact that it's accelerated by Verdun, or made still more necessary by Verdun, should not obscure us from understanding that it's part of the First World War's first great Allied offensive.
The Somme is a quiet agricultural area of northern France. Here, the sites of many dugouts and trench lines can be identified by the chalk marks that still scar the fields. Till now, this had been a relatively quiet sector of the front. The French had occupied the trenches here with only an occasional skirmish to disturb the peace. Albert is a large town lying less than a mile behind the front line. It became known as Albert to the Tommies. The tower of the basilica, with its figure of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, could be seen from almost every part of the battlefield. It was used as an observation post by the British and was constantly shelled by the Germans, leaving the figure hanging at a precarious angle. The troops who marched beneath the Virgin's outstretched arms had a saying that when she fell, the war would end. The battle plan committed 32 British and French divisions, preceded by a massive 5-day artillery bombardment, the biggest to date. 1,537 British guns and 100 French 75mm had poured 1.5 million shells onto the German lines. Bad weather had delayed the start of the attack for 24 hours, which meant the final barrage was less than had been planned. The attack would launch 100,000 British troops in an assault along a 13-mile-long front. There was to be a diversionary assault on the village of Gommecourt in the north, but the main assault would be further south, centered on the line of the Albert to Bapaume road. The Germans had spent 2 years perfecting their defenses. They had deep, shell-proof dugouts bristling with hundreds of carefully sighted machine gun posts. The problem the British faced lay in the fact that they didn't have enough heavy guns to destroy them. The poet Siegfried Sassoon watched the bombardment of the German trenches.
It was a struggle of giants hurling thunderbolts. One couldn't imagine anything living in that hell.
Near Albert, at the village of La Boiselle, there was a major breach of security on the eve of the attack, June the 30th. Contrary to direct orders, a Tyneside Scottish staff officer telephoned a good luck message to the battalions in the front line. This was to have tragic results. The message was intercepted by a German listening post. They now knew the Allied attack would come the following morning. At 7:30 it began with the explosion of several large mines. In many places the lines of troops marching in extended order, as if on parade.
At 7:30 a.m. the hurricane of shells ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Our men at once clambered up the steep shafts. A series of extended lines of infantry were seen moving forward from the British trenches. They came on at a steady pace, as if expecting to find nothing alive in our trenches.
In front of the village of La Boiselle, Major General Ingerville Williams committed his entire 34th Division to the assault. This rare aerial photograph shows La Boiselle with its system of trenches and the craters left by the mines. The plan was for the Tyneside Scottish to attack the village with the Tyneside Irish in close support. Here the troops were ordered to advance at a steady walk, even to light up their pipes and cigarettes. As they moved down the slope towards their own front line, they were suddenly hit by intense machine gun and artillery fire. It was here that the Tyneside Irish suffered their worst casualties.
Just before it started, we heard the larks, poor things. That was the worst thing, waiting for your turn to go over, to get on the step ready to follow on. A whole lot went across, you see, and they were falling down long before they ever got there. Then it was your turn. You got the word to charge. I didn't know what to think, just look for a safe place to cross. One lad had a bandolier with Mills bombs. A lump of his side was blown out and his hand was off. He kept begging, "Will no bugger kill me? Will no one finish me?" He didn't know what to do or say.
Keeping in line in extended order, men began to fall one by one. Our officer said we were all right. All the machine guns were firing over our heads. This was so until we passed our own front line and started across no man's land. Then the machine guns began the slaughter. Men fell on every side screaming. Those who weren't wounded dare not attend to them, but must press on regardless. Hundreds lay on the German barbed wire, which was not all destroyed. Their bodies formed a bridge for others to pass over and into the German front line.
At the village of Fricourt, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry ran into carefully sited German machine gun nests which had taken advantage of every fold and hollow in the ground. As the Yorkshiremen attacked over no man's land, they were caught in the crossfire and cut down. Directly in front of Fricourt, a particularly tragic event was to be played out. The 7th Green Howards were ordered to hold their ground, but at 7:45, Major Ralph Kent defied his colonel's orders, leading A Company into the attack. Of the 140 men who went over the top, 100 became casualties, most within the first 20 yards. Kent, who survived the attack, explained his actions by saying that there were times when an officer should anticipate orders, and that this had seemed to him to be one of those times. On the left flank, the 10th West Yorks attacked at a point known as the Triple Tamber, a German stronghold and already the scene of much bitter fighting. 2 waves of the West Yorks passed beyond the first lines unhindered, but they failed to clear out the remaining Germans. As they moved past, the enemy emerged from their dugouts and opened fire on them from behind. Caught between the guns, the West Yorks suffered 710 casualties, the worst battalion losses in the history of the British Army. Among them was the poet Victor Radcliffe.
For tiny hopes like flowers of spring will come, though death and ruin hold the land. Though storms may roar, they may not break the wing of the earthed lark, whose song is ever bland. Fell year unpitiful, slow days of scorn, your kind shall die and sweeter days be born.
The day had gone badly. There were 57,740 casualties, almost 20,000 of them dead. On most of the front, the Allied assaults on the German line had been a disaster. Only minor footholds had been gained. The Tyneside Scottish and Irish together had suffered 80% losses. The planned advance along the Albert to Bapaume road had been swept away by the weight of German machine gun fire. Following the catastrophic losses of the 1st of July, the only Allied success was in the southern sector of the Somme front. At the village of Montauban, the British, with the help of French artillery, broke through the German line. This was achieved by 2 divisions of the 13th Corps, who seized all their objectives, taking the village by the end of the day. General Congreve was confident that they had the Germans on the run from Montauban. He requested permission from his chief, General Rawlinson, to continue the advance, and not for the first time. This was refused. At Bazentin Ridge, the British had watched on July the 1st as German troops retreated in confusion over the ridge, leaving a gaping hole in their line. This gave the cavalry the opportunity to pursue the Germans as had been planned. But instead, Rawlinson stood the cavalry down at 3:30 that afternoon, allowing the enemy time to escape. He ordered Congreve not to advance, but to stay put. It's argued that Rawlinson's failure to exploit the successes of the right flank was a blunder which cost thousands of lives. Though the Allies now held Montauban, they faced difficult terrain between their position and the Germans up on Bazentin Ridge. From their defensive positions, the Germans could command a clear view of the British movements. Behind their front line, they'd taken advantage of the so-called horseshoe of woods. The British would now have to attack the German flanks, the village of Contalmaison on the left and Trones Wood on the right. These objectives would have to be taken if a breakthrough was to be achieved. Here in front of Contalmaison, Lieutenant George Butterworth, fighting with the Durham Light Infantry, took part in the attack. Friend of fellow composer Ralph Vaughan Williams, he was considered one of the greatest talents of his generation. Nearby, Siegfried Sassoon, known to his men as Mad Jack, led a grenade assault on Quadrangle Trench, a notorious German stronghold.
I went across from our bombing post to where Wood Trench ended, as there was a Boche sniper. The others fired at the parapet, so they didn't see me coming. When I got there, I chucked 4 Mills bombs into their trench, and to my surprise, 50 or 60 ran away like hell into Mametz Wood. Our Lewis guns stayed on them all the way, and I think they suffered.
At Bailiff Wood on the 9th of July, Lieutenant Butterworth led his men against the German machine guns in Contalmaison. A desperate bombing fight followed. For his part in the action, Butterworth was awarded the Military Cross. Next day, the wood was used as a jumping-off point for attacks against Contalmaison by the 17th and 21st Divisions. It fell the following day. Nearby at Mametz Wood, the 38th Welsh Division faced a bitter battle, which would cost them dearly. It took 2 weeks of desperate fighting before this blood-soaked place finally fell. At the second attempt to take the wood, the Welsh crossed this valley, only to be caught by intensive machine gun fire. From their position inside the wood, German machine gunners dominated the southern approach. The Welshmen finally gained a foothold and doggedly proceeded to take control of all but the northeast corner of the wood. General Rawlinson realized that if a success was ever to be achieved on the Somme, the German second-line defenses crossing the Bazentin Ridge at the top of this valley had to be taken, and quickly. He now ordered in heavy artillery and thousands of fresh troops. They had to negotiate the newly won ground under intensive enemy fire, christening the place Happy Valley with the true sense of soldierly irony. On the right flank, Trones Wood changed hands with grim regularity, but its capture was vital to the success of the main attack planned for July the 10th. This would be a daring feat of arms by any standards, an uphill advance in darkness over 1,000 yards of no man's land. The Commander-in-Chief, General Haig, knew it was risky, and his doubts increased when informed that part of the wood was still in German hands. The French were also doubtful, causing the main assault to be postponed for 4 days. The German commander, General Sixt von Armin, used the time to reorganize his men. He planned to launch a major counterattack, hurriedly bringing in several divisions of elite stormtroopers drafted in from the Verdun front. It was now that the German commander-in-chief, General von Falkenhayn, issued a chilling order, one destined to shape the course of the battle. The enemy must not be allowed to advance except over corpses. Not an inch of ground was to be yielded to the British without a counterattack. On the morning of July the 14th, here along the foot of Bazentin Ridge, 4 British divisions assembled in total darkness, as near as possible to the enemy trenches. Then came an intense 30-minute hurricane bombardment. This time the Germans had no warning of the attack. British gunnery was fast improving, and the troops were close enough to rush the German trenches. At 3:45, 22,000 Allied troops left their assault positions in no man's land and headed for the German line on the Bazentin Ridge. The assault was an unqualified success. The ridge was taken with a minimum of British casualties. The captured ground included what became the famous Crucifix Corner. A shell-scarred statue still stands, having survived this attack and several later battles. The next objective was Longueval village. Its capture was vital if any further advance was to be made on the right flank. It was the Scots of the 9th Division who'd been given the job of taking the ruins. They attacked up this track to reach Longueval, pushing the Germans before them. The cavalry were now ordered to spearhead the advance beyond the Bazentin Ridge, but strangely the infantry were then forbidden to pursue the retreating Germans from the key position of High Wood. At this stage, the British could have occupied it, but missed another golden opportunity. The cavalry were in fact losing valuable time as they negotiated the trenches and shell holes around Montauban. Their delayed arrival allowed the Germans to regain the initiative and filter back to retake it. Later that evening, the cavalry squadrons of the 10th Deccan Horse and the 7th Dragoons prepared to take the wood. In support was an infantry battalion of the Queen's Regiment and the South Staffordshires. But as they advanced over this open ground, they were caught by heavy German machine gun fire from the edge of the wood. The attack failed, and with it the hope that High Wood could be taken quickly. It would take another 2 months and many thousands of lives before it was captured. The failure also heralded the demise of the cavalry as an effective fighting force when pitted against the weapons of 20th century warfare. At Longueval village, the South Africans of the 9th Division had succeeded in chasing the Germans out of Delville Wood. They included a unit of the South African Scottish, some of whom had fought against the British in the Boer War. Now they fought side by side. Allied attempts to dig in around the edge of the wood were frustrated by tree roots, frequent German shelling and counterattacks. At this stage, the Germans reinforced their lines with yet more troops and powerful artillery. The Allies were soon to get a taste of their devastating firepower. The German plan was simple. At one blow, a wedge was to be driven between the British and French in the area between Delville Wood and Trones Wood. The first step was to oust the British from Longueval village and Delville Wood. On July the 18th, British soldiers in Longueval managed to link up with their South African comrades. But their triumph was short-lived. At 8 o'clock, the enemy guns opened up, and the Longueval sector was subjected to intense and unrelenting shell fire. The German frontline troops watched the destruction.
The wood was a wasteland of shattered trees, charred and burning stumps, craters thick with mud and blood and corpses everywhere, in places that were piled 4 deep. Worst of all was the crying of the wounded. It sounded like the cattle ring at a spring fair.
Later that afternoon at 3:45, the German stormtroopers attacked the handful of South Africans who'd survived, only to be driven off once more. Meanwhile, the surviving Scots of the 9th Division, though hungry and desperate, were far from defeated. They charged down Longueval's main street in wild pursuit of the Germans, who outnumbered them 4 to 1. Not for nothing did the Germans call them the ladies from hell. By nightfall, the line had stabilized in the Longueval sector. The brave stand by the 9th Division in Longueval had probably saved the entire campaign. As they were relieved, the enormous price they'd paid became clear. They'd suffered more than 7,500 casualties, among them the South African Brigade, which had lost 2,200 dead out of a force of 3,000. The Battle of the Somme must claim many more thousands of lives as it ground on for a further 4 months. It had now become a war of attrition.
In the days long gone by, when the 1st SAI took part in a battle arboreous, mid Delville Wood's trees, with the vertical breeze, I don't recollect feeling glorious. When a pal fell down dead, with no top to his head, we may have used language censorious. But whatever we said, as we looked at our dead, I'm certain we never said glorious.
Put plainly, Haig's policy of attrition now called for the simple expedient of killing as many of the enemy as possible, this by throwing huge numbers of men against the German lines. Ultimately, whoever sustained the least casualties would succeed. It was a grim prospect for the remaining months of the war.
The sun is setting over Albert. Banners of the richest and palest hues float out. They ravish the eye and melt the heart. I turn from them to look over to the east. All along the horizon, gun flashes quiver as if some fearful aurora borealis were continually appearing. Every now and then, huge explosions send up pillars of smoke as though the internal fires of the earth had broken through. It is an inferno. Can anything live in that? Heaven on one side, hell on the other. One should not hope to come out of that alive.
A long way to Tipperary.
By mid-July, 2 weeks into the Battle of the Somme, the British High Command had failed to achieve the hoped-for breakthrough in the German lines. Little ground had been gained, while the casualty lists rose alarmingly. The huge losses meant that many more troops would be needed to achieve the objective of taking the town of Bapaume. Their immediate goal was to take control of the Poitiers-Longueval Ridge and High Wood. In the sweltering heat of July, the fighting took on a new and sinister phase. It would now be a war of attrition.
Technology, the state of weaponry at the time, the massed forces of industrial powers arrayed against each other in equal powers, that decreed the way the war was going to be fought, that it would be a mincing machine in which each side would have to attack across an exposed no man's land in order to batter at their defences, reduce their will as well as their men and their material, so that they would give in. That's the role that the British and the French had to play in the First World War. Where is the flank that could be turned? There is no flank. How might surprise have been earned by this circumstance? Yes, it's occasionally essayed by use of attack at night, by the use of gas, and also by mine warfare. But with regard to decisive surprise, there's very little opportunity, and the war was fought as it had to be fought. And we have to recognize that in terms of human tragedy, the scale is grim.
The full, appalling effect of modern warfare now descended on the Somme with the use of weapons and tactics of mass destruction. The Germans matched Britain's policy of attrition with determined counterattacks. Every inch of ground was contested, and fighting at close quarters dominated the battle. On the right flank, a gap had opened up between the French and British. The only way it could be closed was by taking the village of Guillemont. On the left, Poitiers became a pivot on which the British advance was now turning north and east. This once peaceful village was now a central part of the German defences, its approaches guarded by a strongpoint known as Fort Gibraltar. Its capture was vital if the village was to be taken. The British attack would be from the south of Poitiers, spearheaded by the Australians. They were noted for their more relaxed approach to military discipline. Fresh to the Somme, they'd already established a formidable reputation at Gallipoli. Often regarding their British counterparts with disdain, the Gallipoli veterans would ask, "Have you been fighting, or have you been in France?" The answer would soon become apparent. On July the 23rd, the Australian 1st Division attacked Poitiers Trench and the old German lines beyond. The land here had been pulverized by innumerable shells, turning it into a featureless wasteland.
The ground shook and trembled, and the concussion made our ears ring. It's strange how men creep together for protection. Then we saw the barrage smoke move forward, whistles blew, and we hopped into Fritz with a yell.
The brigade successfully stormed most of their objectives from the flank, including Fort Gibraltar. The worst fighting east of Poitiers centered on the maze of German trench lines running across this stretch of ground. As the Australians advanced, they came under intense machine gun fire. Morquet Farm was to become notorious among the Australians as one of the worst killing grounds on the Somme. Here, as elsewhere, artillery dominated the battlefield, each side relying on its use to destroy men and defences before an attack. The heavy guns were constantly on the move, testing the gunners' physique and morale to the limit. As the battle progressed, so too did the quality of Allied gunnery.
Fritz came at us from the front. We lined the parapet like an excited crowd and blazed like hell at them, knocking them over like rabbits. One Boche was getting away, apparently only slightly wounded, when one of our shells burst on him as though aimed, and he went up in pieces. Well, we cheered and laughed, as though it was the funniest thing in the world.
This is the site of Munster Alley Trench, which ran between Poitiers and the village of Martinpuy. By late July, it was still in enemy hands. It lay between the British and Australian lines, so its capture was vital. The 23rd Division, including the Durham Light Infantry, were ordered to attack. Among them was 2nd Lieutenant George Butterworth. His platoon bombed the Germans back 100 yards and succeeded in halting their attack up Munster Alley. But at 4:30 that afternoon, he was killed. His loss was deeply mourned by the men he commanded. The condition of the battlefield prevented any attempt to get his body out, so his platoon buried him near the spot where he fell in Munster Alley. His grave was later destroyed by gunfire and his body never recovered. His name is now listed on the walls of the Thiepval Memorial, one of more than 75,000 posted as missing on the Somme. On the night of the 4th of August, the Australians finally captured Poisier Ridge. They'd been subjected to a bombardment of unrelenting intensity.
My battalion has been in for 8 days, and they're sticking it still. Incomparable heroes all. We are lousy, stinking, ragged, unshaven, sleepless. My tunic is rotten with other men's blood. One feels that on a battlefield such as this, one can never survive, or that if the body holds, the brain must go forever. For the horrors one sees and the never-ending shock of the shells is more than can be borne. Courage does not count here, it's nerve. Once that goes, one becomes a gibbering maniac. The Gallipoli veterans say that the peninsula was a picnic to this push.
Only 40% of the men engaged on the Somme campaign were involved in actual combat. The constant heavy shell fire had caused severe damage to the network of roads. It was an endless task to repair and reconstruct them. The burden of road maintenance fell upon the Royal Engineer and Pioneer battalions. As the front line advanced, so the infantry's demand for ammunition and supplies increased. Big guns had to be moved forward to cover the next advance, an exhausting and difficult business on tracks ill-prepared to stand their weight. At this stage of the battle, many of the troops were now showing signs of fatigue. Any chance to remind themselves of normality was welcomed. Anything to take their thoughts away from the dreadful conditions that surrounded them. As the casualty lists rose, they occasionally provided the less seriously wounded soldiers with the rare chance of home leave.
I didn't want to give me mother a shock by just walking in the ever-open door. I took the footpath that ran next to the railway and the colliery line. Long before I reached the bridge, I saw somebody waving. It was my mother. She must have left just as she was. No coat, no shawl. She still had her carpet slippers on. She was still panting for breath and utterly exhausted. She collapsed. Our only greeting was made sitting on the wet grass. I carried her all the way home.
This reunion with normality was often brief, and then it was time to return to the front. The village of Millencourt was a favourite resting place behind the lines for British troops. This graffiti was scratched into a farmyard wall by a soldier waiting to go back into action.
It was one of the last evenings before going up again. We assembled in the orchard at dusk. The air was still, and in the distance the rumble of far-off shell fire. We sang a chorus or two to weld us into a unity of mood. The moon rose in the sky. Over the subdued chatter of many voices, the adjutant was playing to himself, meditating in music. The talk ceased, and men turned from their comrades to listen until there was dead silence. When he had finished, there was a pause for a second or two before the applause began, enough of a gap to show that the listeners had been with him into a foreign land.
This is the scene at Guillemont on August the 9th, when the Germans defeated another British attack. During the fighting, Captain Noel Chavasse, a Liverpool Scottish medical officer, went out to search for wounded. It was here in a quarry on the edge of the village that Chavasse sustained a splinter wound in his side. Despite this, he carried a man over 500 yards to safety, winning the first of 2 VCs. He was the only man in the Great War to achieve this distinction. Some of the medical staff not in combat units acted as stretcher bearers. Among them were pacifists unwilling to fight, but prepared to do all in their power to help save lives. There would be no instant victories now, just the slow fight towards the Thiepval Ridge on the north flank and to Guillemont in the east. Poitiers had finally been taken, but at great cost. More Australians died here than on any other battlefield of the war. The policy of attrition now became total. Of all the Somme's sinister places, none was more dreaded than the village of Guillemont.
Each body was covered inches deep by a black fur of flies which flew up into your mouth, eyes and nostrils. I once fell and put my hand right through the belly of a man. It was days before I got the smell out of my nails.
Both sides were suffering as the relentless death and mutilation continued.
You can no longer call this war. This is mere murder. All my previous experiences are child's play compared with this massacre, and that is much too mild a description.
Throughout August, the battle continued on the left flank beyond the Poitiers Ridge towards Thiepval. Moquet Farm, a German strongpoint known to the attackers as Mucky Farm, stood in their way. The Germans had turned it into a fortress. These aerial photographs, taken only a few weeks apart, show the devastation caused by the British artillery. The next objective was Thiepval Ridge. On the 3rd of September, the 49th Division were ordered to take it. As the troops moved into their assault trenches on the fringe of Thiepval Wood, their orders were to attack a position known as the Pope's Nose, so called after the Protestant 36th Ulster Division had been annihilated here on the 1st of July. The story was to be repeated as units of the Duke of Wellington's regiment crossed these fields. The Dukes fought their way through the enemy trenches until they ran out of bombs. The Germans then seized the initiative to attack on 3 sides. As the Dukes withdrew across no man's land, they were struck by concentrated machine gun fire. Many of these men were killed within a few yards of safety. As night fell, the Thiepval Ridge remained in enemy hands. As the battle bogged down, the Allies now introduced a new weapon. The tank was especially developed to break the deadlock of no man's land on the Somme. On the 15th of September, the tanks were sent into action along an 8-mile front between Courcelette and Fleur to spearhead an assault by 10 divisions. The tanks attacked from the direction of Poitiers and Delville Wood. Of the 32 tanks to reach the starting point, only 24 actually advanced. Of these, only 9 were of any use. The rest had broken down or got stuck. The 2nd Canadian Division was sent in to attack the trenches around Courcelette, but their progress was halted by Germans in this heavily fortified sugar beet factory. It guarded the approach to the village, posing a major obstacle for the troops. As the situation grew critical, the one surviving tank in the sector came down this road heading towards the now wrecked factory, much to the relief of the Canadians, pinned down in shell holes. The tanks didn't have it all their own way. Moving so slowly, at only 2 miles an hour, they made easy targets for the German artillery. While their effect on the German troops had been significant, the cost in crews had been high. The Germans fought to the death to hold on to Courcelette. Casualty figures on both sides had been appalling. Among them, Private George Ritchie, aged just 16. He was the youngest soldier to die on the Somme. In the 1920s, when this road was being widened, the bodies of more than 300 men were found, testimony to the carnage here. But perhaps the most sinister killing ground of them all was High Wood. Many thousands of men were committed to its capture. Its evil reputation was legendary among the troops. These aerial photographs show how the wood was progressively destroyed in just a few weeks. At the northeast corner of High Wood, the Black Watch and Cameron Highlanders had been driven back on the 3rd and the Northamptonshires on the 9th of September. This despite the detonation of 2 huge mines. The craters remain, now filled with water. Of all the woods on the Somme battlefield, no other could match high wood for death and destruction. The bodies of at least 8,000 men still lie buried in its depths. As yet more troops were needed, the New Zealanders were brought in to fill the gaps. Their experiences at Gallipoli had helped turn them into hardened veterans. They were sent into action here, in the area known as the switch line between High Wood and Delville Wood. They proved themselves amongst the most courageous and tenacious of any troops on the battlefield. This is their memorial, standing on the site of the German trenches they fought so hard to take. It was also from here that they watched as tanks left Delville Wood to assault the village of Fleur. Once again, the tanks were effective. One broke through the German defences and fought its way into the village, followed by jubilant British troops. The use of the tanks had caused chaos among the German defenders and proved that at last the stalemate of no man's land could be broken. Next into the line came the elite regulars of the British Army. Guards of the 6th Division were ordered into the attack on the right flank. One of their number was Raymond Asquith, son of the Prime Minister. He was hit and was carried to an aid post where he later died. This battlefield had little respect for class or standing. David Henderson, son of the Labour Party leader, also lay dead, killed fighting with the London Rifles at High Wood. The fighting was far from over. High Command resolved to seize the high ground to the east. They needed to take the Tilloir Ridge and the villages of Morval and Ganchy before the autumn rains. The attack fought over this devastated landscape was launched on the 25th of September and became known as the Battle of Morval. It was considered a great success, with many of the objectives southeast of the Albert-Bapaume road taken. The British would now have to maintain their advantage and attempt to push on towards Ganchy and secure the right flank. On the left flank, the 18th and 49th Divisions attacked Thiepval Ridge. As elsewhere on the front, the devastation here had been quite complete. Moquet Farm had fallen, so had Thiepval Village, but it would take several days of fierce fighting before the Thiepval Ridge was entirely in British hands. There was now evidence that German morale was at a low ebb.
No doubt you have heard of the fall of Thiepval. For us, it was absolutely crushing. In my view, every soldier, from private to general, had the feeling that Germany had lost the first great battle.
At this stage, the British moved into the low-lying land on the right flank, losing the advantage of the high ground. Some military thinking suggests that this was a mistake which shook the confidence of the troops in the decisions of its command. To add to the general misery, heavy rain began to fall, gradually turning the devastated battlefield into a quagmire. The troops were constantly urged into the attack in an attempt to achieve their objectives before winter finally set in. The advance on the right flank eventually bogged down, while the dubious honour of taking Le Transloy and Guidecourt fell to the Canadians. But the appalling conditions eventually brought the fighting to a halt as weapons and equipment clogged with mud. This was as far as the Canadians got. It was as far as anyone got. They were also in the front line on the left flank, where they continued their attack north beyond Courcelette. Here, the Canadian-Scottish ran into uncut wire as they attempted to seize Regina Trench on the 8th of October. The assault faltered as the attackers searched frantically for a gap. It was then that 20-year-old piper James Richardson stood up to play in full view of the enemy. Inspired by his example, the Canadians rallied, then charged. Some tore through the German defences with bare hands. Richardson continued to play during the furious bombing fight which followed. He was killed when the Germans later counterattacked. On the 11th of October, the Canadian 4th Division went over to attack the still untaken Regina Trench. Within minutes, most of them were killed.
God forbid anyone from seeing what I saw. The wire was intact. The boys were caught like crows on a dike. Some were still alive out there. One lad alternated between screaming with pain and crying for his mother.
Dominating the road to Bapaume stands an ancient Neolithic burial mound known as the Butte de Wallencourt. From its chalk-covered dome, the Germans could observe for miles around. Ringed with 3 lines of trenches and fortified with machine gun posts, the attacking troops had already discovered the defences on the butte were near impregnable. The job of capturing it was given to the Durham Light Infantry. The constant shelling had exposed the white flint which lay just beneath the surface, adding to the ghostly aspect of the place. Harry Cruddas of the 6th Battalion was one of the first to attack.
Immediately the first wave made off, were met by terrific fire and crumbled up like snow in summer. We held on, and the 9th Durhams reached a quarry on the left of the butte. I took up position with a gun and opened fire on the opposing troops.
The Durhams made perfect targets as they struggled through the mud. This was one of several occasions when the British gained a foothold on the butte, only to be driven off again by the Germans, who were concealed in a network of deep tunnels. The final act of the Somme campaign centered on an attack up the Ancre Valley to take Beaumont-Hamel and Beaucourt. 7 divisions attacked on a 5-mile front. As winter approached, temperatures fell, adding to the discomfort of the troops. The Royal Naval Division included 2 brigades of reservists. These sailors now found themselves part of the army, though they retained their naval rank. The Ancre Valley had flooded with the relentless shelling. The hundreds of craters overlapped, filling with water which quickly froze. Before the war, the River Ancre had meandered its way down to Albert, providing the locals with many pools where they would fish. Now the valley was devastated by the weight of artillery fire, which had been directed onto it. When the Royal Naval Division attacked in front of Station Road, the German machine guns opened up with devastating effect. The Hawk and Nelson battalions were virtually annihilated. Of the 435 sailors who went into action with the Hawk Battalion, 419 became casualties. In what was virtually the last act of the Battle of the Somme, the 51st Highland Division attacked the village of Beaumont-Hamel and the dreaded Y Ravine. It was notorious as one of the most heavily defended places on the front. The Germans had burrowed deep underground, sheltering hundreds of troops against the British artillery. Much desperate fighting took place around here, with the Scots emerging victorious. With the onset of winter, the fighting on the Somme ground to a halt. The Allies had advanced a mere 7 miles at the furthest point during the 4.5-month campaign. The price was a death toll of more than 1 million men on all sides. Those who survived were exhausted. The German commander, General Ludendorff, admitted his army was utterly worn out. He correctly predicted that if the war lasted, defeat was inevitable. Some historians claim the Battle of the Somme as a British victory. But in winning it, a generation was lost.
thunderbolts. One couldn't imagine anything living in that hell.
Near Albert, at the village of La Boiselle, there was a major breach of security on the eve of the attack, June the 30th. Contrary to direct orders, a Tyneside Scottish staff officer telephoned a good luck message to the battalions in the front line. This was to have tragic results. The message was intercepted by a German listening post. They now knew the Allied attack would come the following morning. At 7:30 it began with the explosion of several large mines. In many places the lines of troops marching in extended order, as if on parade.
At 7:30 a.m., the hurricane of shells ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Our men at once clambered up the steep shafts. A series of extended lines of infantry were seen moving forward from the British trenches. They came on at a steady pace, as if expecting to find nothing alive in our trenches.
In front of the village of La Boiselle, Major General Ingerville Williams committed his entire 34th Division to the assault. This rare aerial photograph shows La Boiselle with its system of trenches and the craters left by the mines. The plan was for the Tyneside Scottish to attack the village with the Tyneside Irish in close support. Here the troops were ordered to advance at a steady walk, even to light up their pipes and cigarettes. As they moved down the slope towards their own front line, they were suddenly hit by intense machine gun and artillery fire. It was here that the Tyneside Irish suffered their worst casualties. Albert is a large town lying less than a mile behind the front line. It became known as Albert to the Tommies. The tower of the basilica, with its figure of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, could be seen from almost every part of the battlefield. It was used as an observation post by the British and was constantly shelled by the Germans, leaving the figure hanging at a precarious angle. The troops who marched beneath the Virgin's outstretched arms had a saying that when she fell, the war would end. The battle plan committed 32 British and French divisions, preceded by a massive 5-day artillery bombardment, the biggest to date. 1,537 British guns and 100 French 75mm had poured 1.5 million shells onto the German lines. Bad weather had delayed the start of the attack for 24 hours, which meant that the final barrage was less than had been planned. The attack would launch 100,000 British troops in an assault along a 13-mile-long front. There was to be a diversionary assault on the village of Gommecourt in the north, but the main assault would be further south, centered on the line of the Albert to Bapaume road. The Germans had spent 2 years perfecting their defenses. They had deep, shell-proof dugouts bristling with hundreds of carefully sighted machine gun posts. The problem the British faced lay in the fact that they didn't have enough heavy guns to destroy them. The poet Siegfried Sassoon watched the bombardment of the German trenches.
It was a struggle of giants hurling thunder.
Had a great send-off and a great reception. Cheerio. I'm coming back all right. Anyway, I have that feeling.
The frontline trenches now ran from the North Sea to the Swiss border. In an attempt to break through, the Allies planned a joint offensive on the Somme for the summer of 1916. But in February, near the city of Verdun, the Germans attacked in great strength. This meant the Somme would now be a mainly British attack, with the town of Bapaume as their main objective.
As far as the French were concerned, political and military, it's going to be the first time when the British play a proper fair share of the burden of fighting on the Western Front, and that could only be where, geographically, where it would be most useful to the French, immediately adjacent to them, a circumstance which would be much more under the control of the French than if an assault, a major offensive, were to have been launched in Flanders. And the fact that it's accelerated by Verdun, or made still more necessary by Verdun, should not obscure us from understanding that it's part of the First World War's first great Allied offensive.
The Somme is a quiet agricultural area of northern France. Here, the sites of many dugouts and trench lines can be identified by the chalk marks that still scar the fields. Till now, this had been a relatively quiet sector of the front. The French had occupied the trenches here with only an occasional skirmish to disturb the peace. Great many, it was simply to escape poverty and the drab routine of working-class life. Together, they formed the nucleus of Kitchener's new volunteer army. For many young men, the exotic lure of France was too tempting to resist. In the public imagination, it was seen as a country where the wine flowed freely and where the chance of a romantic encounter was a real possibility. A sense of common identity marked Kitchener's army, much of the recruitment relying heavily on bonds of friendship and locality. They became known as the Pals battalions. The men recruited into the Tyneside Irish and Tyneside Scottish were typical of the mood which swept the country. The Tyneside Scottish had appealed for anyone with a claim to Scottish ancestry to come and join their ranks. They were granted the right to wear Glengarry bonnets and to maintain a pipe band. Their motto, harder than hammers. The enthusiastic volunteers who made up the Pals battalions were soon incorporated into the existing old county regiments. There was a chronic lack of equipment and ammunition for the new recruits, and only a handful of retired officers and men to train them, much of their knowledge and methods out of date. Regular and territorial units had suffered heavy casualties in the first few months of the war, and the men of the new army were now needed urgently for duty at the front.
The men presented an inspiring spectacle as they swung down the roads, all in the best of physical condition, marching with a fine spring. We had a ripping crossing. We came on 3 boats.
In 1916, a series of cataclysmic events overtook this pastoral landscape. These are the now quiet fields of the Somme in northern France, and around here was fought what was probably the bloodiest campaign in British military history. The Battle of the Somme began in the sweltering heat of July 1916 and ended 4.5 months later, bogged down in a sea of mud. When war was declared on August the 4th, 1914, the Minister for War, Lord Kitchener, asked every man to do his duty. In response, more than 1 million men volunteered. The Battle of the Somme would be unique in the way it brought the nation's youth together. The country was caught up in a wave of patriotic fervour. Everyone wanted to be part of the war that would be all over by Christmas. In the first 3 months of the war, some 52,000 northern miners joined up. This despite the fact that the industry was a reserved occupation, exempting them from military service. They were tough young men, the backbone of the British labouring class, used to hardship and ready for anything. Men from all walks of life joined up, and for many reasons, some for patriotism, others for the grand adventure, but for a